Here we go, guys. Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of The Bullet. This is the weekend edition of The Bullet for December 10th, 2022. My name is Paul Lathrop. I'm the Deputy Director of New Media for the Second Amendment Foundation. Joining me this weekend to talk about the weekend review, we have up on the top right corner Rob Morse. Rob, of course, Self-Defense Gun Stories and the Slow Facts blog. Right below me, we have Alex Ooley of the Ooley Law Offices in Indiana, soon to be the creator of a podcast. Not yet live yet, so we won't plug it too hard, but also then on the bottom right is Dan Wos. Dan, of course, the author of Good Gun, Bad Guy series of books and one of the people behind the Loaded Mic web radio show. Everybody, thanks for coming along for the ride today.
Thanks, Paul.
Great to be with you, Paul.
My pleasure.
So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I want to bring up, this is a press release that came out yesterday from the SAF. This is actually a really interesting one. California Attorney General's office has stepped away from defending the constitutionality of the state's new fee-shifting law related to legal challenges of gun laws. I'm not going to go through the whole press release, but basically what's happened is Bob Bonta, the district attorney for California, slammed the Texas law that these laws are patterned after as unconstitutional. And he said, well, if I said that's unconstitutional, this law is almost identically the same with the exception of they substituted guns in for abortion. I can't defend this either. State's attorneys for California stepped away from it, and now the governor has to hire an outside firm to come in and defend this lawsuit. Alex, you're the attorney. I'm going to start with you. This doesn't look like good news for the state of California. What do you think?
At least for the governor's office, that's true. And like you said, Texas had an analogous provision with respect to abortion. And the way it works in the United States is that the general rule, sometimes called the American rule, is that parties that are parties to litigation are going to bear the costs of their own attorney fees, the cost of their own attorneys. And that's the rule unless there's a statutory exception to that rule. And in Texas, the statute said that anyone who challenged the state's abortion provisions would be liable for the attorney fees of the state if the state prevailed in the litigation. So it allowed the prevailing party to collect attorney's fees, but the only party that could be the prevailing party was the government. So if the plaintiffs won, and they were the prevailing party, the government would not be responsible for the attorney fees. So this was a one-sided fee-shifting provision in Texas. Well, the Attorney General from California supported, or actually, I'm sorry, the Attorney General from California was opposed to this fee-shifting provision in Texas, and so now is sort of has his hands tied in California and can't be against the fee-shifting provision in Texas and then for it in California. So that puts the Attorney General in California in a position of not being able to support the governor and this fee-shifting provision in California.
I think there's another layer of politics behind this, Alex. You and I would be hard-pressed to tell a California politician, mostly Democrats in the majority, that they can't hold a contradiction. They hold lots of them. I think what this means is that if they argue this case, then they're arguing that puts a burden on gun owners. Then they're arguing against. Let me flip that over. They're arguing for the law that limits suits about abortion restrictions. And they would, frankly, this is how it works. they get more money in California from Planned Parenthood and kickbacks than they get from Bloomberg about restricting firearms. So they go, okay, who's paying us more? Because we're stuck in this quandary. You're absolutely right. They mirrored the abortion restriction law. So I think they went with the money. They went with Planned Parenthood. They pay them more.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think the other part is that they see the writing on the wall, and that these one-sided fee shifting provisions are unlikely to be upheld. So why support the law in California that's going to be detrimental to their abortion viewpoints and their relationship with Planned Parenthood when they know they're likely to lose?
Right. There you go.
Dan, you got any thoughts on this one, bud?
Well, these guys have covered the legal part of it. What I'd like to, I guess what I noticed with all this is that gun restrictions and regulations and gun control is becoming more difficult for these blue state governors. And if we can go back to my state of New York, where Governor Hochul now has been knocked down by the courts 4 times with her Concealed Carry Improvement Act. So, just to, rather than getting into all the legal aspect of it, because Alex and Rob seem to have a pretty good handle on that stuff, I would just like to say that I get a little chuckle out of this because it seems like we're starting to win our Second Amendment rights back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say if the state attorney general has to back off, that shows the hypocrisy of the law to start with.
When you glance to the side, that means you're usually checking for comments.
I am, and I want to mention, because I didn't at the beginning of the show, if you want to comment on anything in the show, or if you want us to cover a separate topic or whatever, if you're watching on Polite Society's podcast, YouTube, or Facebook feeds, go ahead and comment on the live video there. If you're catching us anywhere else in a Facebook group or anywhere else that picks up the feed, go to Twitter and tweet with the hashtag #TheBullet. And by the way, as of yesterday and including today, we're live on Twitter, which I never ever thought I would say in my lifetime, but I got the tech figured out and Twitter hasn't blocked me yet. So no matter where you're catching us, you can go to Twitter and tweet with the hashtag #TheBullet. Let's see here.
Dan, those laws, boy, this is going to be the theme of the podcast. You could say anything about gun control laws in California, Oregon, and New York. You would be absolutely right. Anything you said, depending on the day of the week, because the courts have pointed in every direction.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Matter of fact, let's talk a little bit about Oregon next. I'm kind of jumping around in show notes, but I believe it was on Wednesday of this week. There was, we're going to let this go forward from a federal judge, and no, we're not, from a state judge. And the as of right now, Measure 114 in Oregon is on hold. There's been a stay placed against it, and the Oregon Supreme Court declined on Friday to step in and put a stay on the stay, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yep.
But Oregon's 114, the entirety of it is blocked right now, and on the federal level, the licensing part of it is blocked for 60 days. So I'm certainly not an expert on Oregon law or the legal field, but both of those to me say that law is not long for this world.
Yeah,
right. And I'm looking forward to the time. I'm looking forward to when some of these, when the historical tradition of the Bruin case will start to be the real thorn in their side. And I think that's going to start happening. I mean, if they start using that as precedents, I think a lot of these laws will just be will be shot down pretty quickly. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, maybe quickly for as far as lawsuits go, as we all know, justice turns slowly. But the good news is, I think we're, like you said, Paul and Dan. I think the side of gun rights is likely to prevail in these matters, and frankly, that's what's needed for temporary restraining orders. That the parties show that there's some harm, that they're likely to prevail on the merits, and that they can't wait for the end of the case or the final decision in the case because too much harm would occur during the pendency of the case. And I think that the judge, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but I think it's coming up next week. The parties are supposed to appear to tell the judge why a preliminary injunction shouldn't be issued during the pendency of the case, because at this point it's just a temporary restraining order, which is by its very name temporary, whereas a preliminary injunction would last for the duration of the case until it's resolved finally and there's a final decision in the case. I suspect there will be a preliminary injunction, and ultimately I think gun rights will prevail in this matter.
Alex, a question, and we see aspects of it again and again. A legislature imposes a law that puts restrictions on firearms owners. You need a license, but they don't put in place the procedural mechanisms to grant that license. Or, yeah, we'll get to it in a year. Well, what happens in the meantime? We're seeing, unfortunately, many judges who say, yes, we understand that we've ordered you to do something you can't do, and that's okay. Yes, your rights are restricted, but there seems to be no imposition on the legislature. Am I right or wrong when I say that?
Yeah, so that's my understanding, right? That these provisions of this law were set to go into effect, but even if you tried to comply with the measures by obtaining a license, the state wasn't ready, didn't have the mechanism in place for you to comply. So you effectively would be without your rights, not obtain the license to exercise your rights, because the state wasn't ready to implement the mechanisms needed to carry out the law. So I think that clearly this would be harmful to the individual rights of the people in Oregon. Yeah, even if they were able to comply with the mechanisms that the law provided for, I think it would be a problem. But here they couldn't even provide the mechanisms to comply with the law. So I think it's a very clear-cut case.
And Rob, let me address that too. Up here in New York, similar thing happened with Hochul's Concealed Carry Improvement Act, where there was the standards for the new testing. It was a new 18-hour course. Those standards were given to the training course, the people who put the training courses together. Like, I think it was 8 days before the law would go into effect. Previously, trainers were under the assumption that the course was going to be laid out for them because the state didn't want the trainers getting involved. They wanted these state-regulated components of the course. Well, 8 days before the law went into effect, the state said, well, we haven't developed a course, but here are the criteria we need you to meet. Now go ahead. You've got 8 days to create this course based on our new criteria. So it kind of talks about what Rob was saying. You know, they set these things up for you to lose, where you don't have enough time. The states and the trainers and the FFL, they don't have enough time to get their infrastructure in place to accommodate these laws. And of course, I believe that's part of the game.
It seems that on the face of it, a more honest approach might be the old standards are in place for a year. We have these new standards. Okay. In a year, these new standards will apply. And then after a year from that, we will hold you to those standards, meaning you have a year to go get this license, and then the rules would change on how we issue. Because otherwise we have people who are denied the right to carry because it's impossible to comply. And judges, unfortunately, it's in some of the articles later, if you've looked down in our show notes, judges let that pass. That passes judicial review. Seems crazy to me. That's probably why I'm not a judge.
I am so glad every day that I'm neither a judge or an attorney, and my apologies, Alex. My BS filter is extremely fine, and the few times I've been in a courtroom as a member of the audience, one time in a case involving my daughter, and other times I'm fighting to keep from screaming, "You are so full of cheese," and it's the people that the judge and the attorneys all just sit there so professional, and I end up leaving because I can't.
I think it's called judicial. Is that what's called judicial temperament? No, that's something else.
All right,
Yeah.
let me get a comment in here quick. There we go. Could this apply to the new brace pistol rules not being ready to handle the number of people complying with the new rule? Can this be applied federally to the ATF, who won't be able to process, and I believe it's process all of them?
Yes, I think it could be potentially, because I've got my doubts that the ATF will have the ability to process and to comply with the new rule. I think what's interesting to me about the rule, the ATF rule about pistol braces, too, is that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights protect people from unlawful takings, and I think that this provision, I mean, you have a device that's lawful for you to own, and then the ATF implements a new rule, and all of a sudden you're in possession of an item that's unlawful. You're a criminal if you continue to possess that item. To me, that seems like an unlawful taking, and I'm interested to see if there are challenges from that point of view. And that goes for the force reset triggers as well, and other devices that people possess lawfully, but then are suddenly dispossessed of because it would be unlawful to continue to own them. To me, that seems like a backdoor taking. And so I'm interested in that from that perspective.
I think, honestly, what's going to happen is the same thing that happened in the 1930s, 1934, when the machine gun and short-barreled shotgun and that all went into effect. The National Firearms Act went into effect. How many machine guns, how many short-barreled shotguns got turned in? Very, very darn few. When New Jersey more recently outlawed bump stocks and said turn them all in, how many got turned in? Absolutely zero. I think that's what's going to happen with braces and that with the new ATF regulation. I think it's going to be on the books. How many people are actually going to get rid of them? Darn few.
And I'm still optimistic that the Supreme Court will limit administrative rulemaking authority sometime in the next term or in the current term, and that ultimately these sorts of rules will be deemed to be unconstitutional and beyond the authority of ATF or agencies like the ATF to make, because really it's the province of the legislature to make the law, and the ATF is a division of the executive branch, and the executive branch is not involved in the creation of laws. So I think these sorts of rules go beyond the executive authority and violate the separation of powers. And I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will address that in the next few months.
We've already seen at the federal level, congressmen like, the guy out of Ohio. I just forgot his name. I'm getting old.
Jordan.
Jordan, who said, just basically told the ATF, we wondered where you invented these new regulations out of whole cloth because they're not in the legislation. Please come to our committees and submit testimony. And the ATF, of course, with a Democrat-controlled Congress, said, yeah, we're going to not answer that. And now Jordan has said, oh, yes, you will.
Yeah, there's a new sheriff coming to the House in January.
Yes.
And there are lots of problems with this rulemaking by the ATF, but I think that the pistol brace rule, a lot like this magazine capacity rule, I mean, I don't think they pass muster with the Bruin test. I mean, they are rules in the case of the ATF rule, or laws in the case of the Oregon law, that don't have a historical analog from the time of the founding, and clearly, I think, burden the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. So if they burden the Second Amendment right and there's no historical analog in the text, history, or tradition, they fail the Bruin test. And I don't think either one of these passes muster.
Let's let me pivot a little bit, because there's another story here that fits that same mold. Talking about the Illinois story, J.B. Pritzker endorsed legislation banning the sale of assault-style weapons and large capacity, standard capacity magazines, and banning most people under 21 from obtaining gun licenses. House Bill 5855, the Protecting Illinois Communities Act, was introduced last week by State Rep Bob Morgan out of Highwood, who was present at the July 4th Highland Park Parade mass shooting. Speaking Wednesday at an unrelated news conference, Pritzker said his administration had consulted with Morgan about the bill while it was being drafted. I campaigned on this, on getting an assault weapons ban passed, a high-capacity magazine ban passed, so it's very important to me, Pritzker said, whether it happens during the lame duck session, which I know is the expectation, or happens during the regular session. There are 5 days of a lame duck legislation scheduled in January before the 103rd General Assembly. Lawmakers who were elected last month are sworn into office, and pending bills expire. I just want to reach Governor Pritzker. I know you watch us on a regular basis, although you never comment. I would like to encourage you to reach out to the state prison where the former people that held your seat are, and ask them how much they've been slapped down by the Second Amendment Foundation. Because guess what? That's going to happen again.
And I often wonder if they just really purely push some of this stuff that they know that's never going to go into law, if they just push it to appease their voter base. Because I mean, obviously we've tried so-called assault weapons bans before, and Biden's been yammering on about it. 21 years old, all this stuff. And is it really, at this point with some of these, are they really trying to get legislation passed, or are they just trying to look good to their voter base? I guess that's my question.
Well,
go ahead, Rob.
No, I was going to ask, I had a question for you, Alec. Maybe you'll answer it.
Oh, what's the question? Sorry, yes.
Would this pass the Bruin test?
Well, I don't think it would. The assault weapons ban, the high capacity magazine ban. I don't think. I say high capacity, and like you, Paul, standard capacity magazines, because most firearms that you buy today come with magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. So I would consider that standard if that's what they come with. So I think either one of these would fail the Bruin test. And there's been some discussion about what period of history we should look to when we're analyzing restrictions on the Second Amendment. And I think the answer is at the time the Second Amendment was adopted, at the time of the founding, 1791. And to the extent that we look to later history, it's only to confirm what we believe to be the original meaning of the Second Amendment at the time of the founding. So I think that that's clear. I think that the Supreme Court will discuss that and flesh that out more in the upcoming term. As a matter of fact, Mark Smith from the Four Boxes Diner had some discussion about this with respect to the election case that was just at oral argument at the Supreme Court. Some discussion came up about what period of history we should look to, and it was an exchange with Justice Kavanaugh that clearly we look to the time of the founding, and to the extent that we look at later history, it's only to confirm what we believe to be the original meaning of the Second Amendment.
Right, Alex. Sorry.
Let me jump in here because I want to throw to Dan in a minute. Alec, what's so fascinating to look at where judges have said, oh, these Second Amendment restrictions are fine. Look, we have law that supports that. Broad precedent in the South during Jim Crow when these laws were imposed to disarm blacks, both to deny them the right to keep and bear arms, and then later the right to vote. And I'm going, are you sure you want to stand up and defend this in court? Dan, the thing that was interesting to me about this Illinois law, and I hope you'll comment on it, it seems that Democrat politicians are harvesting the media bias that's kept most people ignorant about the benefits that firearms ownership gives us. The reduction in crime, the lives saved.
Rob, you and I talk about this all the time. Of course.
Yeah, but you do a better job than I do.
well, we have, of course, we have the Gary Kleck study that shows us 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year, and then we have the CDC study that backed that up with 2.46 million defensive gun uses in America per year. And then we got the one, Rob, that you told me about, which was the Georgetown University study that showed 1.67 defensive gun uses per year. We have the data. We give them the data. You and I write about this stuff all the time. They read our articles, but they selectively ignore the truth. And I mean, I guess to get to your point was that the narrative must be created in order to gain public support and change the way we see guns in America. And by doing that, then they have the support for this legislation. And then they actually get people in office who write this legislation who have already been indoctrinated into the anti-gun mindset. This is where we're at. It's just a constant cycle. The goal I see them shooting for now is the next generation of kids being non-gun owners and anti-gunners, just so they can get more legislation passed. But I don't know. I hope I answered your point. But the truth is the data is out there. We know guns are used vastly more for preventing attacks, saving lives, protecting families than they are ever used for taking lives or committing crimes.
Yeah, we get this comment in here. Gun websites over on the YouTube site says, "Good point, Dan. They can push all these unconstitutional bills, no negative consequences to them either way it goes. If the bill is struck down or if it becomes law, they can still campaign on it, and they can still ask for donations based on them working on these bills that got struck down."
Right, and thank you for the comment, and that's why I put out the question: do they do this to actually pass the laws, or do they do this for their own political purposes? Assuming, and I made the assumption in the statement that that this stuff, a lot of the stuff, isn't even going to pass, and I think Alex kind of confirmed that with the assault weapons thing and the magazine capacities and stuff like that. So there you go.
Sometimes it's hard to read between the lines on what the intentions are of particular politicians. But I mean, you see time and time again, I think laws are proposed just for political purposes. I think we saw that with the student loan forgiveness, for instance. I think President Biden probably knew that was not going to be upheld, or at least going to be put on pause for a little while, but it was right before the election. And I think that helps us read between the lines when you look at the timing of certain proposed legislation. And I think lots of these proposed laws are purely political. But one thing I want to point out too about your comments, Dan, is that I think the data is important. And you talked about the Gary Kleck study, and we can talk about whether or not guns are useful or magazines that hold more than 10 rounds are useful. And I think that they are, and I think we all clearly agree that they are. But our rights don't depend on data. And I want to make that point.
Yeah, good point.
Because whether or not people go to church, whether or not people exercise their right to speak freely, whether or not people exercise their right to keep and bear arms, really doesn't matter. We have those rights, they're individual rights, and whether or not they're useful or people exercise them, I think is beside the point. But I think is useful nonetheless to help support our side of the argument. So I don't want to say that the data is not important. It certainly is. It can be very useful, especially in persuading people who are sort of middle of the road about what side of the fence to fall on.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to change the minds of the most progressive minded people, but you might change the minds of people in the middle who do care about whether or not certain magazines or certain firearms are useful.
Well, Alex, thank you for saying that. This is an example of us, the gun guys, getting caught up in the anti-gun rat race. Here we are, and we are giving out statistics. We're justifying our gun ownership here. We're trying to say, yes, well, we need them because of this, because of that. And it starts to turn into a need thing. Oh, how we justify our need for gun ownership. We should never do. I know Rob loves the need part, right? It's not the Bill of Needs, by the way. But you're absolutely right, Alex. We start arguing and we start playing ball on their field when the reality is we don't even have to be talking about this, or we shouldn't have to be talking about this. We should just say, no, it's not going to happen. Because we have our Second Amendment, we are not going to compromise. We don't have to show you any statistics. We don't have to even talk about this stuff. But unfortunately, the way the argument always unfolds, it's us justifying our position. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
I was just agreeing with both of you and thinking, though, if you're a politician funded by Bloomberg who wants to infringe on the right to keep and bear arms, it is easier when you paint gun control, gun rights advocates as being someone who has, you may have that legal right now, but look at all the lives it costs. Of course, you can make that argument if the media deliberately ignores the lives it saves.
Well, yeah, they use the guilt trip too, because how they'll say how many people have to die before you'll give up your guns, and my answer is all of them.
Yeah.
And thankfully, the Supreme Court in Bruin recognized that individual rights are not dependent on data, because that when they said that the appropriate test is not this interest balancing test, it's not rational basis, it's not intermediate scrutiny, it's not strict scrutiny. All those tests involve interest balancing. What's the public use for these sorts of rights, and does it outweigh a particular governmental interest in protecting society or achieving some other government goal? And the Supreme Court in Bruin clearly said that's not the standard. Does it burden the right, and is there a text history of tradition of this sort of restriction? And I think that clearly that test recognizes that our rights are not dependent on data or the usefulness of those particular rights.
Well, and what I love is the way the court structured that, particularly Justice Thomas. He said, we've already performed the interest balancing test. Are guns dangerous? Absolutely. To whom? Well, both to those who would impose tyranny, to criminals, and to a lesser degree to each other. We've balanced those competing interests, and we've made a decision. Case closed.
I want
Yeah.
Dan. I want to. You brought up a how many people have to die before, and I go back to social media. I'm gonna have to really cut this down and be careful how I say this because we are a family show. How many? When somebody asks how many people have to die before you give up your guns, the return I like is how many rapes have to happen before you cut off your own.
Yes. Oh, right. Yeah. Or you can even take the clean version, Paul, and you can say how many rapes have to happen before you'll take up arms to protect your wives, your sisters, your daughters, and your mothers.
Yeah. Because of inaction by some people, does not give the government the ability to take away my firearms that when my actions have been nothing to do any harm to anybody. So.
Right. Right. And then the other thing is, if I could just add this, a lot of times they'll say things like, well, because we'll say, look, these are mental health issues, a lot of these attacks and a lot of these things. Well, what do you propose to do then about mental health, and I always say the same thing. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. When did it become my responsibility, the gun owner, to solve all the problems of the world and fix mental health? It was never my.
And he just froze up.
And I shouldn't have to fix the problems of the world to keep my rights.
Dan, let me add an arrow to your quiver. After Sandy Hook, there were proposals to fund massively increase state mental health funding from the federal government. Democrat senators blocked the bill.
They don't. Right, they don't want it. It's probably not going to be good for their voter base because now we're putting mental. What's that? It wouldn't be good.
It would be good, but
Well, actually, technically, it would be good for the rest of us, but for them, it wouldn't be good because now you're putting people in these facilities, and that's bad. But and I'll even go one step further, and I don't know if you guys want to talk about this, but I believe that gun-related deaths and gun-related violence and illegal gun usage and all this stuff, I believe it helps the Democrats because without it, the numbers would go down. We try to push the numbers of violence down, and it seems by letting prisoners out of jail and early release and bail reform and all this other stuff that they want. I mean, their actions show us that they want violence to go up. And I always talk about the victim-predator society that I believe they're trying to create at some level. So I don't think they want to fix the problem because they'd have nothing to campaign on and they'd have nothing to justify their gun control laws.
Gun Websites brings up a fantastic point. Look south to an entire country with no private ownership of guns. It's ruled by criminal entities and corrupt state agencies. There is more murder and violence than can even be recorded. I'm going to correct you just a little bit over there, Gun Websites, Pete. There is one gun store in the entire nation of Mexico. It's in Mexico City. And a private citizen can buy one firearm over their entire life that is .32 caliber or less. So, yeah. And then
you're not going to fight an army with that. You're not going to fight an army with that. So that's why that's okay for them.
And he also follows up with Mexico is never included in the stats because it's not a comparable country when gun blamers use worldwide stats. How did Mexico get that way? Was it private gun ownership or the opposite?
Right. Well said.
And to your point, Dan, I think that it's not just Democrats that are guilty of this, but it is with respect to guns in particular that their power is predicated on us needing them. And to the extent that people can't protect themselves, where are they going to look for protection? To the government. And this increase in violence, taking away our guns, that helps them get more power and say to their constituents, you need us to protect you. And that just helps them gain more power, more political power, and more of a reason to tell their voters, vote for me. And I think that is a way that they use the increase in violence as a convenient way to maintain power. And I think that's unfortunate.
It keeps people fearful. And that's another way that they do it is with the welfare system. I mean, we're now 3 to 4 generations deep of welfare families, people whose grandparents and possibly now even great grandparents who were on the welfare system, and this is a way of keeping families in generational dependence. So I agree with what you just said, Alex, and I'll just throw that in there too. The welfare system is another way.
Oh yeah, the welfare system, I believe, was designed to be very hard to break out of, and the design is never. Briefly, it got a little easier to break out when welfare was reform was passed in the 90s. However, those reforms have been reformed and reformed again, and it's back to, if you're on welfare, it's extremely difficult to ever get out of there. So, and this next story I want to jump to, Rob and I cover something similar to this on the defensive gun use segment of the Polite Society podcast. I put this in there in here. 2 reasons. 1, because Rob is here and can help me dissect this. 2, because Alex is here and there's a legal avenue to cover here too. I'm just going to go ahead and read some of this. This one comes off of policetribune.com. It was sent in by a listener yesterday. An armed robbery suspect who fatally shot a gas station clerk after a holdup late last month will not be charged with murder. The incident occurred at a Chevron station in Contra Loma Boulevard shortly after 2 a.m. on November 26. This is a California case. Investigators said 20-year-old Ronald Jackson and an unidentified accomplice robbed the store clerk, 36-year-old James Williams, at gunpoint, according to KABC. That's a L.A. station. Suspects were fleeing the scene of the armed robbery when the clerk ran out of the building behind them with a gun. Security footage shows Williams firing at the suspects from approximately 100 feet away. Contra Costa Sheriff Assistant District Attorney Simon O'Connell said clerk fired a total of 9 rounds during the incident. One of the bullets struck Jackson in the back of his leg. Jackson falls down. The clerk continues, and I'm paraphrasing from here on out, clerk continues advancing, continues firing. The bad guy turns around, fires another shot, strikes the victim in the head and kills him. Rob, I'm going to say, I'm going to start with you. One thing we say on the air all the time, we are not the police. When the bad guys are fleeing, it's time to stop shooting. And
that's absolutely true. If the gas station clerk had survived, he should have been prosecuted. I have a different question, and I'm going to toss this over to Alex. There is a felony murder says that if during the commission of a crime one of the criminals dies, somebody dies, all of those engaged in the criminal act are equally guilty of that murder, because without the initial the circumstance of that felony crime, there would have been none. So we've seen examples, bad guy shoots other bad guy by accident. All the bad guys are charged with murder. Okay, what's so strange to me is if the good guy made a mistake and the bad guy defends himself, wouldn't the murder of the innocent person still be caused by the felony committed by the criminals? Alex, this is more your area than mine.
And Alex is an Indiana attorney, certainly not a California attorney. Let's
but I
bring
think they
that
both
up.
have felony murder statutes.
They do. My understanding is that California does have felony murder, but I will say I'm not familiar with the nuances of the felony murder rule in California. There are different ways to apply it. There are different defenses to it in each state. So I'm not sure how it would apply in California, but I would think that in this circumstance, like you said, Rob, the acts of the robber, the person who committed the robbery, are what brought about the use of force. And I would think that even as the person is fleeing, that would still be part of the commission of the crime. So I would think that in Indiana it would apply, and I don't know for sure if it would apply in California, but I would suspect that the felony murder rule would apply in California. Because if fleeing the scene is part of the commission of the crime, is seen as part of the commission of the crime. At least it would be in most states, I believe.
Let me add another little layer to this whole thing. Alex just talked about fleeing the crime. Is there any justification for the guy to be killing the bad guy as he's fleeing the crime if he's already proved to be a danger by threatening or shooting at the clerk, and if that person, the clerk, feels or believes that this person is dangerous as he's running into society, is there any justification there? Because I always learned, I guess a long time ago, I learned that if a violent attack is committed and that person flees and the person who's attacked believes that that person is going to do the same thing to somebody else, then there is some level of justification for killing him, even as he's running away. I'm asking the question. I'm not making the statement. Does anybody know?
Well, the classic.
Go ahead, Rob.
The classic example is, you're in an apartment building, or you're in your home. You see a bad guy. He threatens you. He turns away, but there are other members of your family at risk. That's just defense of the third person. The question may be, the guy still had the gun in his hand. He was walking where other people might be with intent to commit harm. Now it's harder to argue that there was immediate and unavoidable threat of death or great bodily harm, but it is the point you bring up, Dan. Wait a minute. I don't. He's looking to do this to others. The question is, will he find them? Alex, back to you.
Yeah. So Daniel, your question gets like Rob was saying into the question of defense of a third person, or to society in general. And I think it's helpful to think about this in a couple of ways. One is the way that Rob phrased it, and I think it's the way that Method IU teaches it. Is there an immediate, otherwise unavoidable threat of death or grave bodily harm to me or another innocent person? Or if you think about it in the way that Andrew Branca talks about it from the law of self-defense, is there, are you innocent? Is there an immediate threat? Did you use proportional amount of force? Did you try to avoid the situation? And were your actions reasonable? So I think that the part that's missing here for the store clerk is the immediacy aspect. So even if you're defending a third person or society, the threat to that third person or society has to be immediate. And that's not like a couple of minutes, that's immediate, like in moments, it has to be a threat to that person. It has to be a real threat, not just some potential threat. So I think that trying to use force, especially deadly force, to apprehend a fleeing criminal is very dangerous. And this circumstance, this story illustrates why, not only from that it's dangerous from a life or death situation, but from a legal standpoint, it's also dangerous to engage in the apprehension of a fleeing criminal.
Excellent. Okay, thanks.
All right, let's. We're coming up. We got a couple more stories yet. Rob, could I lean on you? I'm going to have you talk about the "I told you so" story.
There we go. Well, we did. We told you so. Gun rights advocates warned us that a new change to the credit card industry to add a firearms and ammunition specific merchant category code. Those three words are important. Merchant category code. The code was set up for gun stores. And that we said, this is about tracking guns. And it could lead to the denial of lawful firearms purchases by law-abiding citizens. We said this back in September when Visa, MasterCard, and American Express all said they'd adopt the merchant code to categorize sales at gun shops. Months later, several social media posts about alleged gun stores and customers claimed that they experienced credit card issues when trying to make a purchase. Thank goodness Twitter is back. The Twitter account Battlecock Tactical tweeted a post titled, and in quotes here, "Federal Firearms Licensee," meaning gun shops, in a Facebook group shared this, "Looks like the doomers accurately called how the new firearms merchant code would go down," close quote. Battlecock Tactical put up some images which appears to show a retail point of sale system at a gun shop. And it reads, $913 transaction declined. Error code on the merchant's computer reads, I'm going to quote it again, transaction declined. Charge declined due to restricted card. Customer's bank does not allow this card to be used at this type of merchant. How do you know where I'm? Say what?
Well,
Dan?
and we warned
Yes,
about
sir.
this when it was going to go through, and specifically, I had a card at one point that would not allow me to use my card in casinos simply because they thought it was too dangerous for me to go into casinos. That a lot of fraud happened there.
Okay.
I've since dumped that card because I think I am an adult. I can decide what is best for me. I don't need the bank stepping in on my behalf. But I when this story first broke in September, I said there's going to be cards that are declined because the bank doesn't want you going into gun stores, and it's happening.
Let me add to this. You know, this is part one of a two-part plan. The Giffords Law Center. I just wrote an article in Ammo Land. If people want to read the entire thing, but basically what it says is the Giffords Law Center sent a letter to FedEx and UPS, along with encouragement from I think about 4 Democrat senators.
Right.
Yes, Edward Markey, Dick Blumenthal, Cory Booker, Dianne Feinstein, and Chris Murphy. And they're questioning the way guns are shipped. And so now UPS and FedEx have come up with some new policies all of a sudden, and simultaneously both companies, that would require FFLs or gun shops to release their records if they requested them. So FedEx and UPS and other shipping companies know whether or not those are firearms or whatever. It's basically a kind of a way of tracking guns to their addresses, and giving the shipping companies the opportunity to not mail them for orders from gun shops and things like that. So not only, Rob, are they trying to get into your credit card, they're also now into the shipping companies and trying to prevent gun sales that way.
The thing that worries me about the shipping companies is when 5 senators send you a letter that basically says, nice company you got there, be a shame if anything happened to it. What do? I guess as a shipping company, you weren't active enough and you let yourself be taken hostage.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, there's a little bit
and
of.
here's
Go
my
ahead.
question with the shipping. When if I order a firearm from a gun store in Phoenix, Arizona, and I want that firearm shipped to South Dakota, it doesn't ship to Paul Lathrop at my home address. It ships to an FFL. It goes from one FFL to another FFL. How are the shipping companies supposed to know what's legal, what's not legal? These are all covered under the federal background check law as it stands.
Well,
Yeah.
here's a little piece, Paul. I didn't. There's another article by in AmmoLand. I didn't write this particular one, but there was data that showed UPS changed its policy surrounding unfinished frames and receivers, and even told customers that if it found any packages containing the targeted items, or what the Biden administration calls ghost guns, their accounts would be canceled and the items destroyed. So they're taking on these authorities. It's unbelievable to me.
That sounds like theft to me.
Sounds like it to me too.
What's another thing that's interesting about this article from Zero Hedge? Part of it says, and this is a statement from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, as credit card companies were rolling out the new codes in mid-September, National Shooting Sports Foundation lawyer Lawrence Keene explained, it was never about gathering data to aid law enforcement. It is and always has been a concerted effort to pressure credit card companies to deny lawful purchases of firearms and put every single gun purchaser on a watch list. Because, like we've been talking about, this sort of action casts a very wide net, and all it will do is likely deny completely lawful purchasers from purchasing lawful items, and will do almost nothing to stem crime or keep firearms or ammunition out of the hands of criminals. So this is, I think, going to have almost no effect on crime, and will only serve to prohibit lawful people from purchasing lawful items. And I think this also illustrates the danger of what are sometimes called central bank digital currency, CBDCs. And, because a central bank digital currency is just going to be, it's going to cut out the middleman. It's going to cut out the credit card companies and the banks, and the government would simply be able to track every purchase that any of us engage in. And I think that's why the war on cash is a dangerous thing, because they will be able to track every purchase that we make, whether it's related to firearms or whether it's related to our grocery shopping or whatever else we may be purchasing day to day. So I hope that more states take the approach that some state legislatures have proposed, that, hey, if you're going to engage in this sort of activity targeting lawful gun owners, we're not going to do business with you. Indiana had some proposed legislation like that. It didn't pass, but I think that sort of legislation is going to be reintroduced again, and I hope other states do that as well, because if states refuse to do business with these companies, that's going to be a huge loss for these companies, and will pressure them to back down, hopefully.
Yeah. And good point on the war on cash, Alex, because that's also simultaneously happening. There is a war on cash, and I know people of younger generation here, that younger folks in my life that don't even carry cash, don't even use cash, and I find myself hardly using cash, which is a little bit, probably part of the plan. Condition society to use their plastic credit card for everything, and it's going to be easier to control purchases.
I gotta say myself, it is so convenient. I pay and I mean all of my bills. The guy that mows the lawn, I pay through website, through credit card. All my bills I pay through debit or credit card. And I it's rare that I have more than $50 in cash on me. So yeah, it's a convenience factor, and maybe I should start keeping more cash around the house, doing more with cash. But man, anymore it is such a convenience factor for me. I don't have to go down to the electric company to pay the bill. I don't have to go to the cell phone company and pay my bill. It's all just, done right here from my desk. So, all right. Well,
we've been here an hour.
Yeah, we've been here an hour. Let's start by Rob. I'm going to start with you. Tell us about Self-Defense Gun Stories. Tell us about your blog. Tell us about anything else you want to plug, bud.
I host the Self-Defense Gun Stories podcast. I'm working. I think the next episode will be episode 300. I'm a co-host with Paul on the Polite Society podcast. That's considerably longer. It comes out once a week. My blog is at slowfacts.wordpress.com, about 2,000 articles there. My writing's often picked up and carried, like Dan's, at AmmoLand.
All right. Dan, what do you think, bud? What do you want to plug?
Well, I do have this book series called Good Gun, Bad Guy. There's all three editions. Whoops, I'm knocking that one in. But anyway, goodgunbadguy.com is my book series, and people can find that. And right now we do have hardcovers, and we are shipping out autographed hardcover series for complete sets for Christmas. So you can still go to goodgunbadguy.com and still get those for Christmas. I'm also the host of the Loaded Mic, which is a webcast, loadedmic.com, and people can check out some of the stuff we're doing there. Lots of fun on that show. Lots of Second Amendment talk and lots of fun. So there you go. Thank you.
All right. Alex, anything you want to plug today, man? How close is that podcast coming out?
Yeah, so I plan to release the podcast at the beginning of the year, sometime in January. It's going to be called The Forge of Freedom. I'm going to talk about firearms as part of it, but it's not going to be exclusively a firearms podcast. I'm going to talk about personal responsibility and things that people can do to forge freedom, to find freedom in a less free world, and to fight back against the sorts of impositions we talk about on this show, but also in other ways as well. I'm also an attorney and a firearms instructor in Indiana. As part of my law practice with my father, we help people with their firearms rights. If somebody needs an expungement because they've got some criminal history in their past but have led a law-abiding life for some time, we can help people restore their rights to possess firearms. But we also help people who are charged with crimes, whether it's self-defense or other sorts of crimes. We do a lot of criminal defense work. So check out ooleylaww.com if you're interested in that, or o2gungroup.com if you're interested in the firearms training, where we also teach a 5-hour legal class about the lawful use of force in self-defense.
Very cool. You get a couple comments in on the way out the door here. Both of them are very prevalent to what we were just talking about. Robert says, funny, the illegal immigrants use cash and send it out of the country at Walmart. Yeah, absolutely. And Krabby Turtle says, I still write checks for most of my bills and send them using mail. I don't think it's inconvenient. Okay. I'll buy that. I find myself, it's a whole lot easier for keeping track of things for me to do it through my computer, but that's just me saying for my personal experience. On my end, I want to encourage everybody, do come join us Monday through Friday next week, 5 p.m. Central Time, for the regular daily edition of The Bullet. And then next Saturday, let me look and see who's on next Saturday. Next Saturday, we do have a full weekend edition of The Bullet. And joining me next Saturday, as soon as everything comes up, is Brooke Cheney, again, Dan Wos, and Tony Simon. Anytime I have Tony on the weekend edition of The Bullet, it's a really hard one keeping things on on the tracks and keeping things from derailing, but we'll see if we can pull it off next weekend. So that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you everybody for watching, and stay safe, everybody.